friends, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Kaylin. If you haven't been here before, welcome. I'm glad you're here because I'm going to be sharing with you my favorite books from 2021. I hope you guys had a wonderful New Year and holiday season. I took a little bit of a break for the holidays because I was actually able to spend a lot of time with my family, and then I also got sick, so my break was a little longer than I thought it was gonna be. I'm okay, nothing serious, but it definitely delayed my filming a little bit. But before we get too far into the video, this video is actually sponsored by Book of the Month. I have been a Book of the Month member for a long time now. I have a cute little collection. For those of you that don't know what Book of the Month is, it is a super fast growing book service for readers. Their main mission is to promote new and emerging authors, as well as to help readers like you and I find books that we'll love. Their team goes through hundreds of books each month and gives readers their choice from a curated selection of new and early release titles. This allows you to spend more time reading and less time researching. I think one of my favorite things about Book of the Month is that it is completely risk-free, so you can skip any month, anytime, and you won't be charged at all. They also have the best price for new release fiction books. You can get your first book for only $9.99 using the code LETSGO. This month they have some really exciting selections as well. I think they do a really good job of having amazing selections each month and finding a lot of titles that are super diverse from each other. They have 5 different selections that you can choose from each month, and they also have add-ons, so you can look through all of their books and add on ones that you're really interested in. One of the add-ons for this month is The Maid, and I am so excited for this one. This is a quirky thriller. I absolutely love this red and white, like bold graphic cover. The synopsis of this kind of reminded me of the movie Knives Out, if you've ever seen it. This is about a main character named Molly. She is a maid at a hotel. She loves to clean, she loves to have things in order, but Molly's orderly life is upended when there is a murder in the hotel, and she has to figure out who did it before they pin the blame on her. So this sounds like such a fun thriller, definitely a little more lighthearted of a mystery thriller, and I'm super excited to read it. I think so many people will love this one, and it's a great add-on to add to your Book of the Month box if you're interested. Okay, the next one I'm excited about, and I feel like this is kind of a different title than I've ever seen for Book of the Month. It is a short story collection called Fiona and Jane. So all of the stories in this book are about the friendship of Fiona and Jane. They jump around in time and place, but the main message of this book is friendship, especially female friendship, and it just sounds so good. I think it's really difficult to find a book that has a really amazing representation. This really is about a relationship of two best friends and how they're there for each other through all of the difficulties of life, and I am so excited to read this. Friendship is something that is really important to me, and I feel like this is a book that I can get a lot out of, so I'm really glad to see a book like this in a Book of the Month selection. If you would like to pick up any of these titles, I'll have the link to Book of the Month down below, and again, you can get your first book for only $9.99. Thank you again to Book of the Month for sponsoring this video. Let's get into the books that I read this past year. Okay, I'm gonna start sharing my favorite books from this past year. I do have a few least favorite books, but I did talk about those in my recent reads video. I will link that video down below as well as up above, and you guys can check that one out if you're looking for some of my least favorite books. I talk about them all in that video. So we're gonna keep it positive today and we're just going to talk about my favorite books from this past year. I'm going to start with my first favorite book that I read and then go to my most recent. So the first one is The Castle of Tangled Magic by Sophie Anderson. This is a super magical middle grade about a young girl named Alia. Her and her family have lived in Castle Mila for generations. This castle is so magical. I read an article that Sophie Anderson wrote about her inspiration for this castle, and I'll put some pictures right here because she took some inspiration from the churches in Russia, and it is beautiful. I think the architecture is just so whimsical and magical. I loved the scenery in this book. Her family home starts to get ravaged by these magical storms that are super powerful and destructive, and they are tearing apart Castle Mila. So Alia decides that she is going to save her home. She discovers a land through a magical doorway with creatures that are from Russian folk tales. This land is split up into 4 different domes, which are part of Castle Mila, and each dome has different types of magical creatures in it. Alia learns that she is destined to save this land land as well as her home. One of my favorite things about this book is that Alia has to set right the things that one of her ancestors did wrong. I love finding conversations like that in middle grade books. I thought it was really fun to see how Sophie Anderson was able to have this serious conversation but make it feel young and magical. Another thing that I loved was how Alia was able to find the magic within herself and also become this brave, strong young girl. It was so fun to read her story from beginning to end. I love how Sophie Anderson handles serious topics. I just love her books, and I think she's such an amazing writer, especially for middle grade. If you haven't read any of her books, they are so good and definitely ones that I think any age would love. The next one I read is Amal and Bound. This is obviously about Amal. She dreams of becoming a teacher one day, but her dreams are dashed when she accidentally insults a family that is in charge of her village. As punishment for this action, she has to become a servant for this family. This covers so many important topics around economical class, especially in this culture, and what it's like being a young girl who is an indentured servant. I think it's a super eye-opening book and one that I would suggest a lot of people read. Amal is such a thoughtful, brave character. She continues to seek out education even in her circumstances, and it's just such a beautiful story. I definitely noticed that some of the writing in this book felt a little bit younger, but it is made for a middle grade audience. So just keep that in mind, that some of the writing might feel a little younger, but that's the intention. The next one I have is another middle grade, but I think it's the last middle grade I have, and that is Secret Garden. This is obviously a classic, and I want to say before I get too much further that this was written a long time ago. So some of the language used and some of the actions that the main character does are very triggering for a modern day eye. In the beginning of this book, the main character does and says some things that are definitely not things that we would say nowadays, as well as things that would be, I think, in a modern day book. So keep that in mind when you're reading it. Also, it doesn't last the entire book. I think the first chapter or two has some things in it that are definitely really hard to read, but just know that it's not like that the whole book. And I also think that Mary, the main character, is supposed to have this huge transformation from the beginning of the book to the end. So some of the things she does and says are horrible, and she's a character that is really easy to dislike. But I think that part of that is because she transforms from the beginning to the end. But still, I don't think some of these things would be written in a modern day book. With that being said, this is about Mary, who grows up in India with her family. Her parents are really distant and not very loving parents at all. In fact, most of the time they ignore her, and she's mostly raised by servants. Her childhood is extremely traumatic because of the way that her parents have raised her. Her parents are killed and she is left alone in this house. Someone eventually does find her and she gets taken to her uncle's estate in Europe. There she finds this secret garden and she starts to restore this garden as well as make friends along the way. This really is about childhood trauma and how that affects and impacts you and others around you. It shows this amazing, beautiful transformation of characters, how they grow because they find love and happiness with each other and nature. That's a huge part of this book too, is the magic and healing of nature, and I love it so much. This book came at the right time for me. There's such amazing messages in this book, and I think you could get a lot out of it if you can just get past the first few chapters. I loved seeing Mary as a character who was starving for love and affection, and how she searched for it in so many places, including a bird and other animals. And it was such a heartwarming, like heartbreaking, but also hopeful story. The next one I read was Crescent City by Sarah J. Maas. I also did read A Court of Thorns and Roses as well, and I would definitely say that both of these were favorite books of the year. I'm just gonna talk about this one mostly because the reason that I love Sarah J. Maas books, they are the perfect books to escape the real world too. I don't necessarily think that Sarah J. Maas has the best writing of all time. I don't feel like I get a lot of morals of the story from her books, but they are just so necessary for me. Her writing is addictive and her characters are so much fun. I feel like she does such a good job of bringing you into these worlds, and they're just so much fun to read. This one is an adult fantasy book about Bryce Quinlan, who is half fae, and she lives in a world where there are tons of different magical creatures. So in comparison to most of the other creatures that she has around her, she's not very powerful and doesn't have a ton of magic in her, which I love. I love when they start off being vulnerable and then eventually maybe gain more power or believe in themselves more. Bryce lives alongside a pack of werewolves, and the leader of this pack is her best friend. Best friend's name is Danica, and they do everything together. But one day, Danica gets murdered by a demon, and so Bryce vows that she is going to find out what happened to her friend and why this demon came after her, who's behind the whole plot. In doing this, she meets Hunt Athalar, who is a fallen angel, and he's kind of like a detective type of character, and so they have to work together in order to find out what happened, and they end up discovering a lot of dark secrets of Crescent City. Crescent City is such a cool city. I loved the atmosphere of it. In most fantasy, you see kind of a medieval type of atmosphere, and this was much more modern and like neon. I love seeing this type of world with different magical creatures, and there are tons of different magical creatures in this. It's not just like fae and angels, it's like everything. I definitely can't wait to read what happens to Bryce and Hunt, and I think the next book comes out in the spring, so very excited. All right, the next one is The One by John Mars. This is a thriller. This is about a scientist who comes up with this DNA test that pairs you with your genetically perfect match. As you can imagine, this changes a lot of things for the dating world, as well as the relationship world in general. A lot of divorces happen and breakups because of this DNA test. This covers 5 different stories of people that took the DNA test. They're all completely different couples and completely different stories, and I just loved reading about them so much. Each one is super interesting, and I never found myself being drawn to one story over the other. They were all extremely entertaining, and there were tons of twists and turns throughout the entire book, which I think is really difficult to do with a thriller. I know that most of the thrillers that I've read have had one big twist at the end of the book. This one had a bunch of them sprinkled throughout, and it was just so good, and it kept you entertained the whole time. There is a Netflix show based off of this, but if you've seen the show, this book is so much different than the show. So I would highly recommend reading this book if you did. This is a whirlwind and it is so much fun. Okay, my battery died, so hopefully this angle didn't change too much. Moving on to the next 2 books. They kind of go hand in hand because I read them sort of together, and that is the 2 Taylor Jenkins Reid books that I have. I unintentionally read them together. I definitely wasn't planning on doing that, but it just kind of happened. So I started with reading The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, and I got to the part with Mick Riva. And for those of you that don't know, that is where these 2 books are connected. So Mick Riva is the father of the main characters in this book. So after I read to that part, I then read this one and finished it. This book is about Mick Riva's children. He has 4 kids. So it goes into Mick Riva's relationship with their mother, June, and how they meet, and then how he becomes famous and how that affects his relationship with his wife as well as his kids. And oh, it's so good. And then it also goes into the timeline with the 4 kids, and they're throwing an end of the year summer party, and you get to see how these kids have been impacted by their parents' actions. I love the way that each of the siblings handled the situation from when they were kids and how it impacted their lives and the decisions that they made, people that they loved, and all of that. This is another book that goes into childhood trauma a lot and how that impacts people's lives. So absolutely loved this one. And then The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo is about Evelyn Hugo, who is an old Hollywood movie star. The story is kind of told in 2 perspectives as well. You have a writer who Evelyn Hugo has hired to write her biography, and then you have Evelyn Hugo telling her story, but it feels like you're really immersed in it. Taylor Jenkins Reid does such a good job of creating characters. In my opinion, I think she does some of the best characters because they're so realistic and so human. You really feel like you know these characters, like you've seen them or heard their stories before, and they feel so real. I think one of the reasons that she's able to create such dynamic characters is because they're not perfect. They're flawed in a lot of ways. Evelyn Hugo is definitely a very morally gray character. She makes questionable decisions. I think the reason that she makes a lot of her decisions is because of the way that she's lived and the time that she lived. Because this was old Hollywood, they completely wiped her ethnicity and they dyed her hair blonde, they changed her name, but she wanted to sacrifice that to become famous, and she knew that was a sacrifice that she would have to make. She also falls in love with a woman, which is definitely a taboo thing back in the old Hollywood. So a lot of the decisions she makes are based on her wanting to pursue her dream, and in doing that, she has to make a lot of sacrifices and make questionable decisions. I just loved Evelyn Hugo, I loved Celia, I loved all of the characters in this, and I'm just really glad that I was able to finally read this one. Okay, the next one is actually a graphic novel, and that is Avatar: The Last Airbender. So this bind-up has 3 of the graphic novels in them. This story is all about Zuko and his sister Azula and their family dynamic. In the show, you never really find out what happened to Zuko's mom, but it's a big part of their character and who they are. I'm really glad that this book went into more detail on what happened to their mom, why their father acts the way that he does, and how each of them have been impacted differently because of what happened to their parents. Again, I feel like this is a very common theme with a lot of the books that I've read, which is like family trauma and stuff. I don't know, it wasn't on purpose. The first little part of this talks about their mom and where she grew up and who she was as a person, and then the end of it is a full circle and it refers back to the beginning of it, and it was just so good. This is definitely one of my favorite graphic novels that I've ever read in general, but I'm even happier that it was an Avatar story as well, because I love Avatar. Honestly, if you haven't watched the series, you should watch the series because it's amazing. Definitely one of my favorite animated TV shows. I think if you're a fan of Zuko, this is a must read. Okay, we have 2 left, and the next one is Clara and the Sun. This is a book that I think the more that I sat on, the more that I loved. I think it explores really important themes about what it means to be a human. This is about Clara, who is an artificial intelligence. She starts off in a storefront where they sell artificial intelligent robots. These robots are made to be the companions of young children. She sits there for a while, but eventually a young human girl comes in and they instantly bond. Her name is Josie, and her family decide to take Clara home to be Josie's companion. As the story goes on, Clara starts to observe their family dynamic, but because she's an artificial intelligence, she's constantly learning what certain human mannerisms are and what they mean, and it was just so interesting to see the world through Clara's eyes and see the important details that I think most of us would miss. I don't want to say too much else about this story. This is definitely a slower paced book, but I think it's one of those books that will stick with you for a long time and is extremely impactful. I think my favorite part of this was the way that it explored faith versus rationality, and I also love to see Clara learn what it means to love and sacrifice. It was such a beautifully written story, and I'm really excited to read more books by this author. Okay, the next one I have is Sans Tea Party. So this is actually another middle grade, but this is a graphic novel middle grade. The illustrations in this are really adorable, and I absolutely love the cover of this. This is about Laura, who is really struggling with growing up. She still loves the things that she loved when she was a kid. So Laura's finding that she's actually becoming quite lonely and sad because all of her friends are enjoying things that she does not yet enjoy. So she decides to do a seance tea party. She sets up all of her stuffed animals and does a little seance. This is how she meets Alexa, who is a friendly ghost. They become friends. Alexa helps Laura to step out of her comfort zone and meet new friends and enjoy new things. And as the story progresses, you get to find out what happened to Alexa as well. I really enjoyed the way that this book talked about growing up and how hard it is. Even for me as an adult, I still don't want to grow up. I still want to pretend I'm a princess, obviously. It shows how important it is to grow up, but also still enjoy those things that you love. And it's okay to enjoy the things that you did when you were a kid, but you also have to get older, and that's part of life. I think it's definitely an important message for me to hear. Those were all of my favorite books from 2021. It's actually starting to get dark out here. That's the one thing I hate about wintertime, is that it always gets dark so early. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I would love to hear some of your favorites, and you'll have to also let me know if you've read any of my favorites and what you thought about them, even if you didn't like them. But that is all for this video, so thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in my next one. Bye guys, love you!